Welcome, Austin. As I've been reading through our articles lately, it struck me that there sure are. Sure seems like there are a lot of terrorist groups out there. I know we've got Boko Haram, al-Shabaab, we've got Hezbollah, we've got all the different variations of ISIL, Al-Qaeda. Um, Jim, has terrorism been on the rise, or is this something that's been with us for the last 50 years?
Well, uh, two things. First, terrorism has always been around. It's always been in one form or another. The American organized crime, especially the Italian version, the Black Hand, the Casa Nostra, they, like many terrorist organizations, began as a patriotic, liberation, Italian liberation organization. And they eventually, decided, hey, I can make a career out of this. And it turned into basically a gang, which basically depended on terror. Terror is an old fundraising technique for all criminal organizations. And what's ironic, as we're covering all these terrorist organizations, uh, whenever they're beaten, they go back to the mafia ways. For example, ISIL. ISIL no longer controls any territory, uh, and now they lost most of their money, and so now basically have to pay the bills, and they're kidnapping for money. They're running the protection racket is probably the most dependable, and they're raiding. I think we just did an update on Nigeria this week, and they found out that they can make a lot of money off the fishermen on Lake Chad, which borders northern Nigeria. If the fishermen want to go out and fish unmolested or unshot at, as the case may be, you simply pay them a little bit. So yes, there are a lot of them. Terrorism, as we think of it, as people setting up big bombs and things like that, and issuing declarations of, submit or die. That's an Islamic thing. In fact, when we first talked about doing this subject, I quickly reviewed our past coverage of terrorism. I mean, this is not a new subject, and I put together a piece where I realized, and this is basically, I went and checked the official documents, the U.S. State Department and various other organizations cover terrorism. 90% of it is Muslims killing Muslims, and we have covered this in the past. Uh, it's nothing new. I mean, what's made modern terrorism so terrible, at least for the Muslims, it victimizes primarily, is money. There's more money. I mean, if you want to ask, what did the Arabs do with their money? Well, they spent it on consumption and terrorism. I mean, that sounds kind of harsh, but it's true. And we've been very quiet about it because the Saudis have been good allies, as it were. When we asked them to step up and increase production at the end of the Cold War to put the extra squeeze on the Russians, they did it, even though it cost them money. And so we owe them. So when they had to get Saddam out of Kuwait, actually, at first their initial reaction as it came out was to, well, so what are we, the Kuwaitis? And then somebody stepped up and told the king, well, la 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 la, and the next decision was called the Americans. Um, so it's been a mutual relationship which is subject to change depending on considering what's happening in Texas, which is now on its way to becoming, I think it already is the third largest oil exporter in the world, and it's probably closing in on number two and eventually number one. You can frack your way out of some problems. The But for the moment, we have this long-standing relationship, and they have a new king or crown prince. He's going to be the next king, who's making a real substantial stab at reform. Um, and But one of his problems, as it has always been, is that it's Saudi money, which basically funded Al Qaeda initially. I mean, it was voluntary contributions. It took us years to convince the Saudis that they had to crack down. Now, this is difficult to ask because Saudi is basically a coalition of tribes. The British used to joke, the Arab countries are tribes with flags. I mean, well, that was unfortunately true. And Saudi Arabia, the Arabia ruled by the Saudi family, the clan, as it were, is literally a coalition put together by, Abdulaziz bin Saud in the 1920s after World War II. I think one of his ancestors, well, was in, the with that movie. What do you call it? Well, anyway,
Lawrence of
Lawrence of
Arabia.
Arabia, right? They
No,
mentioned
no,
the Arab Revolt, and they didn't mention,
well,
the. Well, I suppose that's good news,
World War One, and
right?
Abdulaziz ibn Saud pushes the Hashemites, which is now I moved up to Jordan, out of Western Saudi Arabia and take over the holy cities. Is what
Yeah,
that was the
and
big.
and the important thing, any diplomat, any Western diplomat had to learn when dealing with Arabia is the tribes. I mean, that's what's happening in Yemen right now. But see, the thing is, before the oil was discovered and Aramco was founded, and before OPEC came along in the 70s, and the oil price went way up, and they had this huge flood of cash, and a lot of Saudis, actually, and a lot of Yemenis, the Bin Laden family came from Yemen. The father, he was an entrepreneur. He came to Saudi Arabia. He started a construction company. He basically was a hustler. And most of them actually were, but the Osama was the bad son, as it were, or the good son, depending on what kind of Muslim you are. And he didn't get as much money as the news would have you believe, but he had access to people who were very wealthy. And these people, by and large, many of them were devout, Muslims of the Wahhabi, faction, which is very conservative. And he would often ask them to, how should I put it, contribute to Islamic charities. And now some people understood that to be, yes, a charity. You're going to build mosques. We're going to send Wahhabi missionaries out to the other Muslim countries to preach. Uh, but it soon became a code word for and other things besides building mosques and proselytizing. Basically, that was terrorism. It's extreme proselytizing. But the thing is, in Islam, that is not an aberration. Islam, the word means submission. It's the only major religion which basically praises and encourages conversion by conquest. Nobody else does that. None of the major religions, anyway. You don't last long because eventually the rest of the world, lines up against you, and you're a former religion. And there have been historically, without going into the details, there have been religions like that which had their moment and then boom, they were gone for good. Um, Islam did not go for good because most people who converted said, "All right, come on, I don't want to go out and conquer my neighbors. I got enough problems." And so you had major branches, so to speak, practices in Islam like Sufism, which is considered somewhat haram, forbidden by the hardcore, which basically preached more of a mystical, concentrating on the how should I put it, on the moral and worship aspects of it, not conquering your neighbor. But unfortunately, Arabia had a hardcore. That was where Islam was founded. That's where the main holy places are, um, and there was all this money available, and that plus global communications. People, once they left the old country, they were no longer cut off. They could basically just turn on the radio or later the TV and hear all the old programs from the old country. And if you were a Saudi or any kind of Arab, you had access to programs which were preaching, war against the infidels, war against the West. And then came the internet, which made it even easier because you could always shut down a TV station that was constantly spewing, kill your neighbors. Uh, but it's much more difficult with the internet. Uh, so basically, we're hoisting on our own petard of the technology. One thing that didn't change, and that's one reason why you keep having a lot of terrorism that does not work. This is something that never seems to sink in with a lot of Muslims. Well, it does, but not the few who you can recruit to be terrorists. Uh, is that it fails again and again? It's been going through the cycle for 1,000 years, but that's why you had this huge burst of terrorism in the 70s. Basically, coincides with the influx of oil money into the Middle East. I mean, there is a relationship. Before that, there were the uprisings. There was the Mahdi in Sudan in 1890. I think what do you call it? Churchill wrote about it. I think he was there. And there's been various other uprisings, mostly minor. The Turks would not the Turks basically took the Mongol approach. If you tried to pull one of these things, they go in there and slaughter everybody in sight. Can't do that anymore. Well, some people do. But the Turks always had a saying: "Do not involve yourself with the affairs of the Arabs." I mean, it was just one problem after another. And the Turks were Muslims. Not only were they Muslims, they thought they could solve the problem by having the Sultan. That's where the Hashemites came to be in charge of Mecca. Uh, the Sultan basically says to the Hashemite family, "Is I'm going to declare myself the Caliph. Is that okay with you?" Hashemites are not stupid, and they said, "Sure, boss. You're a good Muslim," and that lasted for centuries until it didn't. And so now it's up for grabs again, and it's all the money that's driving it. Terrorism cannot exist without people who are willing to support it financially. And you'll see this in every terrorist movement in the world or in history. Uh, if there's no cash, there's no violence, there's no activity. So now, if you ask me, as Dan just did briefly, going through all the various uh, uh, terrorist groups. It's a small list because it basically comes down to Al Qaeda and its offshoots. And ISIL is basically a radical branch of Al Qaeda. The Taliban is a little different. They were basically started by the Pakistani military intelligence to obtain some control over Afghanistan. They are Al Qaeda like, but they're nationalists, not internationalists. They strictly, it's like the difference between the Nazis and the communists. The national, radical socialists and international radical socialists. With Islam, it's the same thing. And in various countries where you had outbreaks of Islamic fundamentalism, uh, like in Somalia, where you have this chaos because basically the endemic clan warfare, which again had been going on for centuries, uh, and the religious leaders got together and they started a thing called the Islamic courts, and this was basically simply literally a local thing where Islamic militias would go out and basically bring peace. This Al Qaeda came along and said, "Hey, we got a system. You want to be a franchise?" And it was all downhill from there. You had al-Shabaab got big, and then it got small real quick because everybody combined against it, including unusually the Sufis who will stay out if possible. But if you corner them and shoot at them, they have guns. They'll shoot back. Uh, Same thing in Yemen, where the Islamic terrorist organizations were always a minority thing. The current civil war going on there was basically Shia tribes, which are basically these are Shia tribes which are on both sides of the border. The ones on the Saudi side are loyal because they're paid off. It's money. It's worth their while. If they go against the Saudi state, A, they're broke. B, they're outnumbered, and of course they've seen what the Saudis do with all the aircraft and smart bombs they've learned how to use. They don't have rules of engagement. Iran tried to jump on that and say, "Look, the Saudis are slaughtering civilians," and nobody would stand up and say, "Well, look, what they're doing is not basically paying attention to human shields." I mean, they're not killing civilians just for the sake of killing civilians like the Assads are in Syria to drive them out of the country. That is definitely a no-no. But when the rebels will basically put all their equipment or basically only move their forces when they have some women and children in tow, the Saudis will bomb you anyway. Now in the West, that's a war crime. In Saudi Arabia, hey, that's the way we do it here. So cultural differences. Be that as it may, the Shia were not rebelling for religious reasons, but for to try and eliminate the corruption, which has always been a noble cause in Yemen. And they had a lot of Sunnis back them initially, but eventually, the Saudis intervened. And and Iran, who always gave some support to the Shia rebels, mostly in the form of a little money. I mean, nothing big. It became major once the Shia rebels, captured the capital in 2014, and now the Iranians are regretting it. So Uh, Unfortunately, it's a simple answer. There aren't many non-Muslim terrorism groups. There have been some, and there are still and a lot of them, but they're dormant. There was the one in Sri Lanka, which was basically Tamils fighting against the majority. It's usually a minority versus a majority deal. And they were defeated. There were the Armenians. There were Armenian terrorists running around. They were blowing up airplanes and what have you. They quieted down. There are various, ethnic. There've always been ethnic, terrorists in Southeast Asia because you had a lot of minorities there. But usually, they're just looking for a better deal. You offer them a deal, usually financial, or give them job rights, whatever the case may be. They prefer to do something other than killing. With Islamic radicals, with Islamic terrorists, the, the, there is no end game except world conquest. And while that may make that's a funny punchline in some cartoons, in real life, it means endless, mayhem. And that's what we're saying. Now, here's the problem. In the past, before all the money came along, the terrorists would come up. I mean, if you go back and there are histories that would show this one, this one, this one. There's dozens of them, major ones and some minor ones. And usually it's a local thing. I think the last few in the early 19th century, there was a God. I think there was one in Somalia, the Mad Mullah. This is the British, giving the names. But anyway, these things were local. If they were in Turkish-controlled territories, they were stomped out very quickly. Um, but now they can sustain themselves, and that's what makes this outbreak of Islamic terrorism different. We feed it. I mean, literally. I mean, for example, our foreign aid operations, which it became a big bone of contention when somebody did the math and realized when you, back 50 years ago, governments, especially American and the Western in general, started outsourcing running foreign aid. The World Food Program and various other organizations, Doctors Without Frontiers, et cetera, et cetera. They say, hey, look, donate money. We're certified, reliable charity, et cetera, et cetera. And they were. Just give us lots of money, and you won't have to send your diplomats, your civil servants, people who don't want to be there. We do want to be there. That's the only people we accept. But the problem was they go into a place. Somalia was a poster child for how this goes wrong, and the bad guys, in this case, Muslim, Islamic extremists, would say, "Oh, we don't really want you here, but God, we're starving you to death. You can move your food in if you give us a cut, or if you pay additional fees and what have you." And basically, the Western aid agencies, if it were a government, they'd say, "Screw you, Jack. This is political poison back home for us." But for the charities, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, they could more easily hide, and they felt a calling. They had a need. We're not Muslims, we're Christians for the most part, and we basically turn the other cheek and just keep trying to get the food the aid to the people who need it the most. Unfortunately, eventually it was realized that why is this particular insurrection going on for 10, 12 years? It's because how are they sustaining themselves? I mean, basically, it's the same old story. And I remember years ago, I had to go down to lectures, new analysts on how to do simulation and how to tease out what's really happening. And I basically told them, because I kept running into this, I said, follow the damn money. None of these groups basically, live on promises and hopes and what have you. They got to eat. They got to buy ammunition. They can't always steal what they need. They basically need cash. And I saw eyes light up, and then later on ran into guys saying, you're right. We've been more successful when we started following the money. And all of a sudden, you saw on the war on terror, after '01, more and more, it came down to the financial people, tracing money. Suddenly, it became more difficult to send money over to countries that had Islamic terrorist groups operating because a lot of it, and of course, you saw people in the United States and other Western countries arrested. These were immigrants for basically organizing and moving money to the terrorist groups back in the old country. who were basically the reason why they immigrated in the first place. I mean, go figure that out. I mean, that's what you're up against. And once it becomes self-sustaining, again, because of the West, because of the people who are trying to help them, it becomes very difficult to subdue or to stop. So basically, what we've done to this cycle, the thousand-year-old cycle of Islamic terrorism, extremism, is we found a way to keep it going indefinitely.
Austin, that was quite a tour there that Jim just gave us. What do you have to add?
Well, I'm going to point out one thing though that was the predicate to the arrival of petrodollars to spark Middle Eastern terror organizations, and that is the terrorist groups that the Soviet Union backed. I won't say formed, even though some of them they did form. Arab secularists. If you remember Abu Nidal, the
Yeah.
as an example of it, he was a Marxist. The Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, which we still occasionally cover, but we had that separate Kurdish war. Uh, uh, Wars around the world, we covered that separately for about 12 or 13 years, and very heavy action starting in '82, and it was a Cold War backed secular Marxist terrorist organization. Those existed, and they were existing in the '60s. Think about the Red Army faction. Remember
Yeah, well,
that group in Germany as an
it was
example.
the old Lubumba University crew.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And where there, Jim's referring to the university in Russia named after Patrice Lumumba, who was a Marxist activist in the Congo, and that's what the Russians named this school for radicals, but it was a training ground for radicals that could operate as terrorists. So you had these organizations. You also had some Islamist extremists in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And I'm thinking here of Saeed Qutb, who was really the theorist, the poet, the philosopher of Al Qaeda. He was put to death by Nasser in 1966. So that predates again the oil explosion. But he thought about that. He thought about that these are ways that for we the weak to fight back, and the roots of that the roots of we the weak fighting back in a guerrilla war or terror war. It has been with us forever. You can even if you look at the Jewish zealot revolts, the Romans considered some of the Jews in the second revolt to be terrorists. Just to put the give a political perspective to it. And that we're predating Islam there. No, they're not the only ones who would have fit into at least something quasi terrorist organization, even though they were revolutionary, ethnic, political rebels. Well, so were these cadres that the communists were putting together to operate in the developing world, third world, also in Europe. Now, Jim touched on. I just point out that you had a model that quickly adapted to this Islamist globalist drive that feeds a lot of the major terrorism on the planet now. And then the Iranians' action is a kind of a combination of that. Their ayatollahs are globalists. Of course, it's a Shia-led global Islamic revolution. They've got that propaganda pitch, and that, if we want to call it, that's their strategic goal. But it also unites, in Iran's case, with an Iranian state goal of reestablishing the we call it the Persian Empire. To them, the Iran, it's Aryan, their Aryan Empire of the first millennia BC. It sounds outrageous, but it's not. It's there. That's part of what's going on with Iran, and they use terrorist groups, terrorist tactics to promote that agenda. If anything, to also keep their enemies unbalance their enemies. But let me pick up on a couple of other things that Jim mentioned. I'll pick up on a Balkan group, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, IMRO. Well, now it happens to be a political party, resurrected and revived in Macedonia. But in the 19th century, it was first a guerrilla group that used terror tactics that were influenced by the anarchist terrorists of in Russia, Europe, in the United States as well. Over time, though, lacking success, they became a criminal organization, another Balkan smuggling ring, and organized crime, like Jim brought up the La Cosa Nostra in Sicily. It was a local protection Italian Sicilian revolutionary group. Of course, look what it became: criminal organization. The Colombian communist guerrilla groups that Jim still occasionally writes about, even though one of them, what's the group that's becoming the political party now, Jim?
FARC.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, listen, they were a drug gang for about 40 years, maybe longer than that. They were hiring their former guerrillas out as gunmen to cocaine cartels, and used some of the same smuggling requires some of the same skills that being a guerrilla requires. Were they a terrorist group? Absolutely. They waged a terrorist war against really the people of Colombia, which is one of the reasons they ultimately lost. And you have, and the Colombian government was some aid from the United States and U.S. primarily. Succeeded in stopping a revolutionary terrorism that was being follow the money, ultimately fed by drugs. The United States drug appetite. Our mess feeds that. There are other ethnic groups. I'll bring them up. You used to see a lot of Moluccan terrorists. Remember those guys, Jim? They would hijack trains in Holland, and people would say, "Where are the Moluccas?" Well, they were Dutch reformed Moluccans, Malays, ethnic Malays, the Moluccan Islands. Sometimes it would be called Spice or even Nutmeg Islands, and you'll find out. But the Moluccas, and they had been the premier forces in the old Dutch East Indies army, even in the old way back, the Dutch East Indian company, which was running what is now Indonesia. They didn't want to be controlled by Muslims from Java, and the Moluccas are still predominantly Christians, and they conducted, because the Indonesian army, which is overwhelmingly Javanese and Muslim, would just go smash them on their home islands. Well, they would conduct occasional terrorist acts to get attention in Holland. I believe they had set off a bomb in London. In fact, I know they did in these places, and the reaction would be, "Who are these people?" Well, that's what I'm trying to tell you. They were trying to say we've been wronged, and we should have been our own country, after the Dutch withdrew. That may have been the case, but they turned to terror. Well, they they've stopped. Jim mentioned the Armenians. Yeah. The Azeris still think of the Armenians as being terrorists, but that's another that's slight changes.
A real estate dispute.
That's a realist. Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. And look, Balukis, the Balukis are Sunni Muslims, but the Iranians call them terrorists because the Balukis, there's a slice of eastern Iran that is ethnic Baluchi, and the one of Pakistan's provinces is Baluchistan or Baluchistan. You'll hear it both ways. It's western Pakistan, and the deal that the Baluchis have with the Pakistanis, and they look at them as being folks from Sindh, the Punjab. Okay, that's the way they look at it. They look at them as Indians, is what they look at them as. Indian Muslims is the deal that Islamabad has with the Baluchis is you guys, you can mind your own business, and part of that, and we'll leave you alone. And they pretty much do because Baluchis were one of the military tribes. They had a rep just like Zulus and Dinkas just to pick up to, or some of the Nepalese. Well, yeah, Gurkhas is maybe the premier example, but there are other ones. Here in the U.S., Comanches had one of the that's still one of the most toughest tribal fighter reps, but and it's not quite the same situation with the Baluchis, but they have launched limited number of attacks because they're angry at their mistreatment by the Aryans, and they have used terror tactics. Don't hear much about it because there aren't very many journalists in there, and the Iranians don't want people knowing that that's going on. But every once in a while, you'll read something about it. I've already hit the thing about moving from revolution to crime. Jim, the IRA. One of my, I should say, I've got to be careful about this because it sounds like I admire the Irish Republican Army. I really don't. I don't admire what it became after after the murder of Michael Collins. Let's put it that way. So that puts it back to, when is that, 22 or something like that? I think that's when he was murdered. He was the old Irish Republican Army's military chief of staff, an outstanding guerrilla fighter. But over time, you had a part of the IRA becomes an Irish political movement. No doubt about that. But part of it becomes a gang, a drug gang, a smuggling organization, and a militant, quote unquote, anti-British, even fighting over the Belfast area, the northern counties that are of Ulster. But the IRA was responsible for developing some of the techniques, bombs, timing, raids, communications. I'm talking about a tactical level that you see replicated in some of these Muslim groups now. The Russians spent time looking at what the IRA did. Now, so if this, I'm pointing this out because somebody comes in and says, "Well, listen to Jim Dunnigan and Austin Bay picking on Arabs." No, I'm not. You can see where the roots of a lot of what we'll call modern terror and the anarchist movements of the 19th century, and you can see some of the development though coming early 20th century, and the Irish Republican Army plays a role in developing some of the techniques and that we see today, even including remote detonation of bombs, even though it would be with with wires, not radio in 1916, but they certainly got to that in the 1970s. The last thing I'll say, Jim, talking about following the money, aid. I think some listeners know this if they looked at some number of things I've written or investigate my website on this. I've been active in developmental aid organizations, primarily through my church, but active supporting or involvement in some of the programs since the 1980s. Seriously, since 1999. It is so. Jim described a number of these groups, even the secular ones, definitely the sectarian ones, quite accurately. You have people in them that want to do something for people who are suffering. A lot of them don't have any kind of security background. Now, if they're going to stay in it and they're going to operate in some place like South Sudan or Somalia or Yemen, they get smart very quickly. Usually they decide not to expose their own personnel to that. They also learn, like Doctors Without Borders, very, very astute regarding the security for its clinics. And that outfit operates in some very, very difficult places. They may say some things, and I will challenge, if they want to challenge me on this, fine, I know the truth. They may say some nasty things about the British government, the American government, and the like, but they know who their friends are. Their friends are British and American paratroopers and French Marines like that will actually come dig them out. But they do get preyed upon, PERAEY, by the revolutionary organizations, ethnic rights organizations, some of them are armed movements and terrorist groups, just as the way Jim described it. I think it is, well, the Yemen situation is an exemplary mess of the way that food shipped in to the World Food Program can be skimmed by the Houthis. Less is going on now since the Saudi coalition has them more or less surrounded the main port, Hodeidah, and the Emiratis are basically doing the same thing with Aden down in the south. But once the convoys leave and go into some of these areas, and one of the areas where there are a lot of starving people, how many I don't know, but it would be at least several 100,000 in this area, is in the northern hills, which is the Houthis' home territory. So right there, moving this food. Last time I looked, where the food sources were coming from, a lot of it, this is now 6 months old. On this was Canadian and American grains, not solely, but that was what primary was at least in transit. Then it's all right. It goes out, and then the Houthis, who are trained, propped up by Iran's Al-Quds special forces, special terrorist operations, rake it off. And right there, you've got it's not money, but it's food, and it's as good as if you can barter it, it's as good as money. How do you stop that? And the question is, as Jim said, the organizations, both the sectarian and secular one, are run by people that don't want to stop it because they feel morally committed to feed the poor and the starving. Anyway, that's I think that it's worthwhile looking at that because it's a what I will say is a valuable and good intention prolongs a bloodletting. That's a real problem, isn't it, Dan?
Yep,
So,
it is.
yeah.
Jim, one last thing. The Philippines has a unique situation where they've got two flavors of terrorists in their
Yes,
mix.
many countries do. India is an example. Well, one thing I should add to put this into perspective. What Austin was describing with Lumumba University and what have you was basically an ancient tactic. In other words, if you want to weaken your enemy, support internal enemies over there, and that's been going on for centuries. And again, remember the ancient Romans. They're the people they were never able to beat was the Iranians or the Persians, what have you, and they were constantly supporting rebel groups. Now the Jews, of course, were a force unto themselves. And you saw how that was dealt with. They basically ran most of the Jews out of enslaved them or just basically sent them to the wherever. Um, and that's how the Romans typically, deal with these things. That's where the old saying comes from. They created a desert and called it peace. But uh, the Russians were the communists, the Bolsheviks in particular, since they were international socialists, as it were. They basically refined it. I mean, they refined. They basically perfected the most effective means of torture, something they don't like to talk about, and also how to basically find and fund and energize, as it were, terrorist organizations in the enemy's countries. So this is something that will never change. That's what the American Special Forces was basically built for. Not so much to create terrorism in foreign countries, but in wartime to send in troops who knew the local, the local culture, the languages, and what have you, had already developed contacts, and to basically help raise resistance, as it were, better resistance against the occupying, presumably communists. But it didn't make any difference. So that has always been there. As Austin was pointing out, you have these things, these revolutions going on. For example, in Indonesia, you had Timor, East Timor,
Oh,
which
that's a good example.
became independent. But now you've got a new one. Well, actually, it's an old one in Papua. The these are places the Indonesians grab, which they shouldn't have. And, the Dutch tried to deal with these areas before they left, but the Indonesians said no, no, we want it all, and they got more than they bargained for. Because in Papua you have the Melanesians, uh, look more like Africans, but they're not. I mean, they're basically the original peoples who came out of Africa, over 100,000 years ago, and moved into southern. That's why the Tamils in southern India, they they look like Westerners with a permanent tan. Uh, and the Melanesians are very similar. Um, and they look different from the Malays, which are related to the East Asians, who only later moved down into the tropical areas. Be that as it may, they're ethnically different. They became Christian. Many of them are not even Christian. They're the ancient religions, what have you. There are hundreds of different tribes, and they are rebelling. Now they have, again, it's the money. They have no support. The in East Timor, they were Christian. They had Western contacts. They were able to get external support. They had people who were educated, they had a migrant community who could basically send money. That's what kept the war going in Sri Lanka with the Tamils. You had expatriate Tamils, especially in the West, who were making more money and basically funded the rebellion that failed. So that's something else you've always got. But all these rebellions, what makes them different is they have a finite, you know, reasonable goal. Independence for Timor. Timor eventually became independent. Papua New Guinea, I don't know. I mean, East Papua is an independent country. It used to be part of the Australia, the colonial Australia, and the English and the Australians decided no, no, no. Let them be independent because they knew, people that operated up there. Just you do not want to try to rule this place because even the locals can't rule it, and that's another story. But the point is, you've got these things going on, forever. And but again, what makes what makes Islam different is that they will go on to perpetuate. I mean, generation after generation of young, uneducated, men living in countries. I mean, the Arabs never without democracy, without modern technology, because the Arab terrorism, fanaticism, radicalism is based on the fact that they reject everything modern, well, except weapons, and cell phones, but anyway, all that stuff. When you get the Islamic State, they have long lists of things you're not supposed to touch that are haram. Now, weapons and what have you, yeah, that's good because it helps defend Islam. But most of it, they want nothing to do with, and that includes education. For example, Boko Haram, they were basically Taliban wannabes. Who have since split into two factions, but I'm not going to go into that. You can read strategy page. Uh, Boko Haram literally means, no Western education. And that's what they've certainly done in one area, which contains about, 4 or 5% of the Nigerian population. They've eliminated most of the schools. And that's causing great hardship. And that's one reason why they lost. Most of these organizations, even the IRA were extremely unpopular after, the 20s with most Irish, and I know that for a fact because I had Irish immigrants in the '60s. As some of them working for me, and I'd ask them, oh, they say unladylike things, the women, about what they thought about the IRA. And that's the same thing with Islamic terrorism. But the thing is, they have a means of regenerating, and now they have a means of getting funding to really do damage, and enough damage in the West for the West to consider it a terrorism problem. And it is a terrorism problem because they kill enough of Westerners, that they are basically the major source of terrorist activity in the West, even though it's very relatively small. Um, and there's no easy way to eliminate them. Now, in Afghanistan, you might get the Colombian solution. One reason the Colombians basically suppressed this leftist organization, which is what the Philippines also had, and it is also, the NPA, whatever. Uh, they eventually die when everybody realizes the communism doesn't work. Not everybody took the lessons of 1989 to heart, but they uh, they 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 realized that whatever is going on, like with a narco, kingdom, as it were, a narco state, which you had in Colombia, which you had for a while in Peru, which actually you had for a while in Burma. Uh, it's very popular. It makes a lot of money, but it basically creates a lot of local addicts, which means the majority of the local population hates you. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, you don't hear that out of the mass media because they don't get it. Do you realize they don't, it's never a story. I mean, they'll say, yeah, we'll report, yeah, there's a lot of addicts, there's heroin addicts in Afghanistan. Ain't that awful? But they don't realize what that means in the big picture. Most Afghans hate the Taliban because they, like FARC in Colombia, uh, signed on. They needed money, and the easiest way to make money was to be, hire guns, for the drug gangs, and that's the only thing that keeps the Taliban going at all. And ultimately, that comes to an end. The trouble is, where's the what do you call it, the heroin capital of the world going to go next? It used to be in Burma. It was run out of Burma, in the '60s and '70s. That's a whole other story. It ended up in Pakistan. Didn't last long in Pakistan. The Pakistanis realized real quick, what a plague this was. It was in Baluchistan and the tribal territories. They drove it right out. It ended up in Afghanistan, and that's where it was. And after the Russians, well, basically they established themselves because during the Russian war in the 1980s, there was even less law and order, as it were, in Afghanistan than there normally is. And when the dust settled, the drug gangs were basically a source for money, and nobody really cared. I mean, the the Quran doesn't forbid heroin, doesn't forbid opioids because they didn't exist. I mean, actually, opium did, but they didn't know about it. Alcohol was the big, bad. So they basically will tolerate it for a while, but then they realize a lot of their most promising children, or even their wives and their other members of the family are becoming addicted and becoming zombies. It has a devastating effect on tribal cultures where family is everything. There is no national government that's going to look after you. No Social Security. It's either the clan, and if the clan has too many, addicts to deal with, it's catastrophe. And too many people in the West just don't get this. Even though what happened in Colombia, they don't realize that it was basically the Colombians looking around and saying, "What's the biggest problem in this country?" Drugs, el narcos, and that's what mobilized support to put them down. And that again, that's one that's one advantage we have in the strategy page. We're all a bunch of old historical game and simulation fans. You realize if you just put the pieces together, it usually creates a different picture than the media finds adequate for their means of scaring people.
Okay, hey Dan, I want to make one quick point before we close up on this. East Timor was invaded actually by Indonesia. It was a Portuguese colony.
All right. Yes.
That's right. Well, no, Jim. I just doing this so we don't get 4 or 5 angry emails on this. No, that's all right. But
no, it was something the Indonesians grabbed because it was
absolutely
their sphere of influence.
Absolutely, and it was okay, an opportunity. We're going after these Catholics. That's what they're Timorese Catholics. They'd done the same thing to Flores, the island of Flores. Get it? That it was primarily Portuguese Catholics, but it was part of the Dutch East Indies. So were the Moluccas. But with the Javanese, and I'm laying it on the Javanese because it really was primarily the Javanese, and that's the way they see it. By the way, the Timorese and the Moluccans came and, hey, we're going to grab it and we'll grab it all, and they did. Maybe it was a grab too far. You brought up Papua, western side of New Guinea. It is a problem, and the Indonesians have so many problems. I say this: they don't need that problem, and yet I'll make a quick comparison to this, and then we'll cut it off. And there are some very, very rich mineral deposits in that part of New Guinea. I won't say as much as the Congo, but it's, if you think of a mini Congo, you get the idea. And it's U.S., Chinese, Australian, Indonesian companies operating in there, but the deal is they're all protected by the Indonesian army. That said, Jakarta hasn't done anything for these poor, for the people of this province. They run it as a colony, in my view. The Indonesian government runs Papua New Guinea as a colony.
Well, we'll wrap it up there.
You won't see that anywhere either.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up there. I think this is a topic we could literally talk about for hours and not even finish it up then.
All right.
We'll talk to you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.